Je vais le projeter, mais mettez-vous sur les articles si vous pouvez. On va commencer par lire quelques extraits de 2 articles critiques qui sont en ligne. Je vais les projeter, hein, mais pour ceux qui préfèrent. Alors... Alors, il y a déjà l'article de Ruth Lindeborg. Si vous le voyez, je ne sais pas, il me fait un truc bizarre. J'ai essayé de surligner les passages intéressants sur ma version, donc ça vous permettra de les voir plus facilement. N'oubliez pas pour demain la réunion à 18h sur l'activité intégratrice, hein, donc pour tout le monde, où on essaiera. Et surtout préparer les questions que vous aurez. Il faut en profiter qu'on soit tous là. Il y a peut-être des questions auxquelles on ne pourra pas vous répondre tout de suite. C'est la première fois qu'on met ça en place, donc il faut qu'on se consulte s'il y a des questions un peu compliquées. Mais justement, ça nous permettra d'avoir l'ensemble des questions et de pouvoir vous faire un document, une sorte de foire aux questions par la suite qu'on vous mettrait en ligne. Hein, donc c'est vraiment important. Si vous avez des questions, si vous avez des interrogations, soit des points de détail, soit autres, que vous puissiez y réfléchir pour demain et que vous puissiez nous les poser à ce moment-là. Et on vous donnera déjà le maximum des informations, mais ensuite on gardera peut-être, on verra peut-être entre nous après pour certaines questions, parce que quelquefois vous posez des questions tout à fait pertinentes, mais auxquelles on n'a pas pensé, et comme c'est la première fois qu'on le met en place, il faut qu'on se mette d'accord pour ne pas vous raconter n'importe quoi lors de la réunion. Voilà. Okay, so last time we focused on the different types of immigrants and the way immigrants in Britain and the way they became visible in the public sphere, especially in big cities, but not only in big cities, but more particularly in big cities, and the way they were perceived at the time. We've also seen that the way they were perceived depended on the type of immigrant, with a particular perception of the Irish, a particular perception of Africans, a particular perception of Chinese people, of Jewish people, and each time stereotypes associated with each category or community of people, depending on the relationship between Britain and the country they came from, or depending on the assumptions that the Victorians had about them. I wanted to complete what we said last time with the reading of a few excerpts from 2 critical articles included in your curriculum. The first one being entitled The Asiatic. At the time it was Asiatic, which was used as a name instead of Asian. Asiatic, I don't think it's still used today, or at least it's very seldom used, but at the time very often it was Asiatic and not Asian. And the boundaries of Victorian Englishness. And this article is written by Ruth Lindeborg in Victorian Studies. It's an article dating back to 1994. And I have underlined a few excerpts on which I wanted to focus, which in a way illustrate what we have already said about the perception of immigrants, the new visibility, maybe not audibility, because they were mostly voiceless in the sense that they very rarely expressed themselves in the press, or, yes, in the press at the time. But still, they were more and more visible. And this is what the critic writes. New theories of evolution and new political geographies, the latter produced by continuing expansion of the empire, transformed thinking about race and nation in mid to late Victorian England. Most evolutionary theories rationalized and reinforced Victorian sense of difference from the savages of their colonies. But the growth of the empire paradoxically reduced that distance by making these supposed prehistorical peoples and the places they inhabited part of Britain's identity. I'd like to focus on this first part of the paragraph. There are several aspects which we have already indirectly dealt with here. First, the fact that the adjective new is repeated several times, the fact that the Victorian period, especially the second part of the Victorian period on which we are more particularly focusing, the second part of the Victorian period was marked by all that was new, with many inventions, many scientific breakthroughs, many new theories, especially about the origins of man. And what the critic explains here is that with the expansion of empire, at the same time, the Victorians became closer and closer to the peoples they discovered, peoples in the sense of the peuple, to the peoples they discovered in the colonies, closer and closer through the accounts that they read about them, through the films that they could watch about life in Africa, for instance, or life in India. They were very short films, but still they presented to the Victorian viewer a kind of slice of life in Africa or in India. And of course, their vision was much, their perception of these foreigners when they arrived in Britain was very much influenced by the new theories of evolution, the fact that man was supposed to be a direct descendant of the ape, and the Victorians thought that the evolution had implied several stages, several steps, and that some peoples were at the bottom of the ladder of evolution, the scale of evolution, while others, like the Anglo-Saxon, were at the top of this scale, of this ladder. So the discourse, the imperial discourse, obviously influenced the way the Victorians thought about people. And the paradox that the critic underlines is that, on the one hand, the Victorians insisted or did everything they could to show or to express the fact that they were so different from the so-called savages, those that they called the savages. So they wanted to show that they were completely different from them, that they were superior to them, and at the same time, the distance with these so-called savages was more and more reduced due to new technologies, the fact that at the end of the Victorian period you could send a telegraph to Africa or to India, the fact that the world was becoming, in a way, smaller, the fact that the connections with the rest of the world were becoming more and more obvious and easier and easier. So a paradox between
the fact that they thought, and they especially wanted to think, that they were completely different from the so-called savages, and the fact that the distance with the people in Africa, in India, or all the other eastern countries or southern countries was shorter and shorter due to new technologies. 19th century thinking about these colonial possessions certainly distinguished between different territories of the nation, its English heart and its British imperial outposts, and the different ways individuals or groups could be defined as British subjects. But Salter's excessive attempts to contain the contagion of the Lascars' physical presence in London suggest that these distinctions are unstable. There are two aspects which are quite interesting to analyze here. The first is the aspect or the image of the English heart and its British imperial outposts. The English heart and the British imperial outposts. Always this image or this metaphor, which I've already shown you in, you remember the map of the Great Exhibition with England at the heart of the ground floor, and all the other exhibits coming from the colonies around England, as if England was, well, the mother country. This is how they called themselves, as if England was the brain, in a way, and the colonies were just the limbs. But of course, the limbs cannot work if the brain does not give guidance, does not give instructions. So they considered themselves as the brain, and they considered the colonies as the limbs, the arms and legs of Britain. At the same time, important to Britain's status in the world as the workshop of the world, but considered to be inferior. And the second aspect, or the second word, which is interesting here, is the word contagion. Very often, foreigners, when they arrived in London, generated discussions about possible contagion. The metaphor of disease was very often used. Many British people born in England and living in England were afraid of being contaminated by foreigners. So the notion of a disease, the notion of a kind of virus, the notion, you remember I said last time that the Irish were very often associated with a disease, with the notion of contagion. Well, this was very often the case. Here, she's speaking of the Lascars. The Lascars were the Indian sailors, and the fear that these Indian sailors generated in the British-born population, or in the population living in England. So this notion of contagion, the fact in a way that the empire, in a way, came to the mother country. This was the idea. In 1982, Salman Rushdie wrote a very interesting essay entitled The New Empire Within Britain. And he explains here that in the 1980s, that is more than a century after the end of the Victorian period, he explains that imperialism still existed in Britain, but it was not the same type of imperialism in the sense that the colonies were no longer abroad, but the people from the colonies had come into Britain after the Second World War to work, to help reconstruct Britain after the Second World War, and that the British had, in a way, recreated colonies within Britain, with the different communities living in Britain. And Salman Rushdie explains that, according to him, the people from the former colonies from the Commonwealth who had come to Britain were still considered inferior by most British people. They were still considered different from the white British man or the white British woman, and that the notion of imperialism could still be applied to Britain in 1980. Of course, this is an argument which is a very provocative argument, but still there is something particularly interesting in what Salman Rushdie explained. And this is exactly this is exactly what the text says here, the fact that the distinction between the English heart and the British imperial outposts, except that at the time the British colonies were outside England. They were scattered throughout the world. Well, the article focuses on a man called Joseph Salter, who spent his life, almost all his life, working on the well-being of Asian seamen, that is mostly Lascars coming from India and South Asia. So it's an article about his work. And the author, the critic, explains how Salter, a Victorian man, adopts the pose of heroic explorer to describe his efforts to save the Lascars from the two most common material outcomes of racial difference in Victorian London, jail or dire poverty. But like explorers of remote territories of the empire, or domestic social explorers probing the wilderness of urban poverty in Victorian London, Salter expresses anxiety about the effect of heathen contact on Christian subjectivity and English territory. So you have here a missionary, typically a missionary, an urban missionary, typically the man who worked for the Red Cross, for instance, and who spent his life trying to help foreign people, mostly Asian people, Asiatics, as they were called at the time, mostly Indian Lascars, to help them out of their poverty, out of their difficult situation when they arrived in London. And yet, you typically have here the position of the explorers of the time, whether they were explorers at home, that is what I would call urban explorers, explorers discovering the city and trying to understand the mystery of the big city, or whether they were explorers abroad in the colonies. Salter here does not work in the colonies. He works with people, with foreign people in London, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in England. But at the same time, he has exactly the same attitude of the explorers who explored the heart of Africa at the time, or the heart of India. So there was a complete assimilation, I would say, between the way the missionaries of the time approached the problem of poverty in England, in Britain, generally speaking, and the way the missionaries and the explorers of the time approached life in the colonies in Africa, in India, etc. Probing the wilderness of urban poverty in Victorian London, Salter expresses anxiety about the effect of heathen contact on Christian subjectivity and English territory. And you see here still this notion or this fear of contagion. What will happen when the heathens, those who do not believe, or those who are not Christians in a way, what will happen when the heathens are in contact with Christian people? And there was this fear of a contagion that the whole of England would become a heathen country. This is why most missionaries wanted to convert foreigners at the time. They wanted to convert them to Christianity, and they did convert them, many of them, to Christianity. Sometimes it was the only way for foreigners to be partly accepted, that is, to be converted to Christianity. Yes, so the notion of conversion is expressed here. The image of a stranger gazing at St. Paul's seems to have been a popular emblem in the second half of the 19th century. Well, this is the image. You see, that is people on camels or dromedaries, and they are looking at St. Paul's. And the title of the poster is "The East in the West." And this superimposition between a very Western background with symbols immediately recognizable in the background, and a very Eastern set of characters here is, of course, quite striking. And apparently, it was quite a famous image at the time, in the sense that it showed, or it expresses, the fear of people of being more or less invaded by people who did not look like them, people that were different from them. But the foreignness of these animals and their riders also threatens to estrange London from itself, as signs of the East literally enter the still shining city. And you see here, it's true that in the way the picture is drawn, you have St. Paul's, but St. Paul's seems to be invaded in a way by signs of the East. The letters, for instance, are typical of a kind of Oriental letters, the way they are drawn, so that this notion of contagion is quite present in the poster itself, and it was very often expressed at the time. Another passage which shows you the way the fear about strangers or foreigners within England was expressed is this one. If the Asiatic possesses a cultural and ethical agency, he also has the power to transform English culture and to reveal England's precarious hold on civilization and on superiority to the uncivilized societies it rules. In their evangelically inspired partial recognition of Lascar's subjectivity, Salter's narratives face the source and speed of the infectious threat that transforms English slave owners into despotic rajas and London pubs into opium dens. Salter finds it rather amusing to notice how some Chinese opium smokers had, by a certain twist or turn, converted a common billycock hat into a headpiece of the most approved celestial shape. But he quickly abandons his detached customs and manners tone when recounting foreign reformulations of English norms of gender, class, or civilized behavior. Detached ethnographic narration of exotic and childish hat-making gives way to metaphors of contamination and fears of hidden similarities between East and West. The turn of Salter's rhetoric against its own representations of Lascar's subjectivity marks what Homi Bhabha terms colonial ambivalence, the traumatic impact of the return of the oppressed, those terrifying stereotypes of savagery, cannibalism, history, and anarchy, which are the signal points of identification and alienation, scenes of fear and desire in colonial text. Well, I'd like to focus on this return of the return of the oppressed. There was this fear, the fear that existed, the fear of contagion, the fear of the West being invaded by the East, if you want, or the North being invaded by the South, was based on a very ambivalent feeling. The ambivalent feeling was fueled by the fact that many of the people who went to Africa, to India, etc., the explorers, were going to devote this lesson to the explorers in Africa and Asia at the time. Many of them were said to become mad when they were there. Take, for instance, the example of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Heart of Darkness, which is the basis of the film Apocalypse Now, which is set in Vietnam in the film, but Heart of Darkness is set in the Congo in the late Victorian period. In Heart of Darkness, you have a character called Marlowe. He's the narrator of the story, and he's sent to Africa, to the Congo. He's sent to the Congo to find an explorer called Kurtz, who has disappeared in the wilderness of Africa, and he's sent there to find him. So Marlowe arrives in Africa, he discovers Africa, he has very ambivalent feelings towards the population that he meets there, and at one point he finds, at last, at long last, after a long journey in the middle of the jungle, he finds Kurtz, except that Kurtz has become mad, as if he had been contaminated by the wilderness, by the so-called madness of Africa. And when Marlowe arrives, Kurtz is dying, and when he looks at him, dying, he looks at him in the eyes, and he sees a very empty eyes, as if all humanity had left him, and the only words that Kurtz is going to utter before dying are the horror, the horror. That's what he says, the horror, the horror. And this horror encapsulates, if you want, the horror that many of British people and many imperialists in general felt that there was in Africa. Something that to them was dangerous, threatening, and something which, according to them, contaminated even the best British people, if you want. And what Homi Bhabha, a contemporary critic, calls the colonial ambivalence, the traumatic impact of the return of the oppressed, those terrifying stereotypes of savagery, cannibalism, history and anarchy, which are the signal points of identification and alienation, scenes of fear and desire in colonial texts. What it means is that very often the African or the Indian other was at the same time fascinating and repulsive for the Victorian man or woman. Fascinating because he saw in the other a kind of first stage of his own evolution. So they imagined that if they had not been born in Britain, they may have been like these so-called savages that they more or less despised at the time. Fascinating because the others had completely different customs, had a completely different approach to gender, to culture, to civilization in general. And even if it was frightening to many people, especially because they had been taught, they had been told, the idea had been imposed upon them that these people were dangerous, that they were violent, that they were wild, that they were uncivilized, that they were savages, etc., etc. There was at the same time fear, but also attraction. It was a very ambivalent feeling. And the fear of contagion was part of what Homi Bhabha calls the impact of the return of the oppressed. As if when in contact with the so-called savage peoples, the Victorian people were afraid of being contaminating and of returning to the state of savagery. There is a sentence that Oscar Wilde wrote in the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, which very well epitomizes this. He says, the Victorians, I can't know, it's not exactly the Victorians, I think it's the Puritans or the, I'm just checking the exact sentence, yeah. The 19th century dislike of realism is the fear of Caliban, yeah. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. And the 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in the glass. Donc il y a deux phrases. Je ne suis pas là toutes les deux, mais... Donc, the 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in the glass. Caliban, do you know who Caliban is? He's the monster in The Tempest by Shakespeare. So he represents primitive instincts, you know? Apparently completely opposed to 19th century bourgeois people, Puritans. Caliban is a monster expressing his primitive instincts. So, the 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a mirror, seems to be implying what? That when the Puritans of Victorian England read a romantic text, they don't like it because they don't see their own face in the mirror. So because when they read a romantic poem, for instance, they understand that they are not represented in the poem. That's their, I would say that their actual personality, is not at the level of what the poem expresses. That they have desires that do not fit with the purity of the romantic desires expressed in the poems. And the 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in the mirror, means exactly the opposite. That is, when the Puritans looked or read a realistic text, they disliked it because they recognized in the text, in the crude descriptions, for instance, of, I don't know, of life, of basic desires, they recognized themselves, but they didn't want to admit it, because at the time, of course, you were not supposed to express such desires, such ideas. Vous comprenez ce que je veux dire? Hein, c'est vraiment cette idée que, finalement, quand on déteste quelque chose, selon Wilde, c'est soit parce qu'on se reconnaît, mais qu'on refuse d'une certaine manière l'image qui est renvoyée de nous. Donc dans le réalisme, les puritains se reconnaissaient, mais comme ils étaient puritains, évidemment, ils rejetaient les images crues qui pouvaient exister dans les textes réalistes, ou les représentations réalistes, et d'un autre côté, ils détestent le romantisme parce qu'ils auraient bien voulu ressembler à l'image donnée des personnages romantiques, mais qu'en fait, ils en étaient bien loin. Donc c'est cette peur de ce qu'on cache en soi, d'une certaine manière. C'est ça qu'il appelle Baba, Homi Baba, the return of the repressed, or the return of the oppressed. La peur que ces soi-disant peuples sauvages, qui n'étaient évidemment pas plus sauvages que les Britanniques, qui avaient simplement d'autres coutumes et d'autres cultures, que ces soi-disant peuples sauvages, qui soi-disant étaient en bas de l'échelle de l'évolution, qu'ils allaient les contaminer et les faire revenir, eux, en bas de l'échelle de l'évolution. C'était cette peur, d'être traînés par le bas, d'une certaine manière. C'était cette peur qu'ils expriment. So this text particularly stresses this, and the attitude that was expressed towards foreigners at the time was most of the time tainted by this fear of contagion, of invasion. The second text I'd like to have a look at is Newcomer, The Rhetoric of Race, etc., by Paul Deslandes. It's about, well, it's just a few passages. It's about the presence in British universities, Oxford, Cambridge, and other universities at the time, the presence of foreigners in universities, because we very often focus on the presence of poor foreigners, poor immigrants. So there were also people in the Victorian time, rich people, wealthy people, who came from India, mostly, some of them from Africa, but it was rarer, who came from India, South Asia, rich families, wealthy families, Indian families, and who went to study in an English university before going back home with their English education. And the article is about them. It's about them, that is the group of foreign students at the University of Oxford in the mid-19th century, and the way they were received. And interestingly, the article shows that, well, this is not the point of the lesson today, but interestingly, the article shows that these foreign students were treated almost in the same way as the first female students were in Oxford or Cambridge. That is, as others, as people who were not part of the group, as people who were not part of the characteristic identity of Oxford or Cambridge. Yeah. Despite a range of fragmented identities and competing voices in undergraduate culture, which included the athlete, the intellectual, and the aesthete, the serious-minded and the silly and the pious and the agnostic, the majority of Oxbridge men assumed that they possessed certain shared or unifying traits. Oxford and Cambridge undergraduates, for example, defined themselves as white Britons, Protestant Christians, imperial leaders and gentlemen whose existence at the universities was ideologically and physically separate from the feminine. In a sense, they were seen as the epitome of 19th century British manhood. So these universities, obviously, at the time, mostly, well, for a long, long time, had only been open to white boys, and their identity, even if there was a multiplicity of men, of young men there, some of them sportsmen, some of them intellectuals, some of them agnostics, some others Christians, etc., etc. So their identities were multiple, but still they considered that they shared one thing in common: they were white, British young men. So that all the others who arrived in Oxford in the second part of the 19th century, who were neither male nor white British, were alienated from the group of Oxford or Cambridge students. Definitions of this sort were predicated on assumptions that supposedly inferior groups, like women, the working classes, other nationalities, Roman Catholics, non-Christian religions, and colonized peoples, did not possess the traits assigned to undergraduates and British men more generally. Continental Europeans, particularly the French, the Italians, and Indians, were frequently characterized in a range of discourses as effeminate and functioned as effective contrasts in formulating definitions of British masculinities and the nation. In general, they relied on a concept of the otherness in defining themselves both as Oxbridge men and as British subjects. So this implied that all foreigners, including French people, European people, were othered from the group, were alienated from the group. The French, for instance, were considered to be effeminate. And they were associated with this notion of effeminacy. Well, probably in the French universities at the time, the same went with British people. I don't know what they were called, but probably effeminate as well. That was very usual at the time. Yes, first they tended to characterize the two most obvious groups of newcomers, women and white and non-white foreigners, as the very embodiment of the dangerous changes and reforming impulses that were invading the universities and threatening the powerful but precarious status of the British man. So you see, we have exactly the same pattern here. Whether the situation deals with poor neighborhoods in which you have Indian sailors, African musicians, for instance, and you have the fear by the working class especially, but also the middle class, the upper class. The fear of an invasion, of contamination because of their presence in a university in which normally people were supposed to be able to think and to be able to analyze things. The reaction was exactly the same. The fear of being invaded, the fear of being contaminated by the others. Whether the others were women, black people, Irish people, French people, or else. But it was really the fact of not being part of the Oxford or Cambridge identity, that is, not being a white British subject. Right? So, at different levels, the fears expressed are exactly the same. Always this notion of contagion, of contamination. And of course, when you face the other, whether the other is a woman, a black man, an Irish man, a French man, etc., when you face the other, you also do what at the same time? Facing the other is also facing oneself, because you define the other depending on the way you define yourselves. The other is generally defined in relation to your own norms, to your own assumptions, to your own stereotypes. So the presence of others, the presence of others that you could face, that became visible in the public space of Oxford and Cambridge, meant at the same time that this presence challenged the way you related to your own identity and the way you defined your own identity. And this was why these contacts, which, and you have to keep this in mind because today it's so usual to have these contacts that it's difficult to imagine the situation at the time, but you have to keep in mind that these contacts had been very rare before. So they were the first real contacts with foreign people becoming more and more visible. And this, when they became more and more numerous and more visible, this generated anxieties, fears that are expressed in the different texts that we have read so far. So this meeting, in a way, these contacts with the other, whether they took place in the urban space or in the space of the university, in the academic space, generated anxieties and fears. It's always the same pattern that is described. And you see here, once again, the notion of invasion, incursions or invasions is repeated. So always the same words: foreign infiltration, invasion, incursion. Nothing new, because today you still find people using the same images to speak about the presence of refugees, for instance. So there's not been, well, there has been progress. You can't say there has not been progress, but the same types of reactions still exist, especially in moments of crisis. Right. So the process of othering, which is a typically post-colonial concept, that is, the notion of othering was not expressed in the 19th century. It's only 1 or 2 centuries later that we are able to reconstruct and deconstruct this process. So the notion of othering was very much associated with the Victorian desire to map the world. To map the world. The Victorians were to map the world. Sorry. To map the world. What do I mean by mapping the world? Well, we have already seen this as far as urban exploration was concerned, what the urban explorers wanted to do by exploring the city was to map the city. The city was a new environment at the time. The city had grown very rapidly, the big cities had grown very rapidly throughout the 19th century, and there was this necessity to master the city. There was this necessity to understand the city. And to understand, to decipher the city, you had to map it. Hence, all the accounts describing the streets of the city, you have many texts about London, for instance, all the maps as well, actual maps that were published of Victorian London, for instance, mapping all the streets of the city and trying to encompass the new reality of the city. But this notion of mapping, of discovering the city, was also applied to the colonies, to the world at large. That is, the Victorians were very, well, they had, the Puritan Victorians had many defects, but one thing that they had for themselves was that most of them were very eager to learn new things. It was a period when people wanted to learn new things. And this was made possible, of course, by all these inventions of the 19th century. So that when they wanted to map the world, well, they needed explorers, of course, to go to the countries that were not known to the British, and to map or try to map the world, especially what critics called uncharted territories. That is, territories that had never been mapped before, at least never been mapped by the British before. So their aim was this, mapping the city, of course, but also mapping the world. I'm going to show you a map of Africa at the time, but before doing this, I would like to say a few words about this notion of othering. When Britain and other colonial powers spoke about their colonies, they othered the colonized countries. They considered them inferior, and they considered them inferior because simply they imposed their own European norms on them. And of course, when you start from a norm that you have defined yourself, if someone does not fit the norm, you may consider that the other acts in an abnormal way, is out of the norm. Except that the norm, of course, is something that you have defined yourself, right? And that this norm is not, a discourse which has to be applied to absolutely everybody. So there is this aspect, the fact that they imposed their own way of seeing. If you take the example of maps, by the way, have you ever wondered why Africa was in the south of the map and the northern countries in the north? Well, simply because, yeah, of course, it's European-centered, absolutely. A map is completely European-centered because the first maps were also published by Europeans, and the vision of the world on a typical map, with Africa in the south and the Western world, well, Europe in the north, is typically a European point of view. Nothing would have prevented them, except their pride, nothing would have prevented them to present the world with Africa above and Europe. It's just a norm, once again. You see what I mean? It's just a norm. So this norm, again, was imposed on the mapping of the world. So that the mapping of the world is based on the vision of Europeans, of Westerners, obviously. Notwithstanding the fact that other peoples in other parts of the world may have had and probably had a completely different point of view. A completely different relation to time, a completely different relation to the world, a completely different relation to customs, etc., etc. So what mostly the Europeans did is that they imposed their norms, and they considered that all that did not fit their norms was abnormal, was inferior. Who defined the fact that to be civilized, you needed to be industrialized? The Europeans, obviously. The Europeans. It does not mean that because you are not an industrialized country, that you are not a civilized country. The very notion of civilization is also, or the norm of civilization is also imposed by the Western countries, the northern countries, on the South. So, by doing this, by stressing, I would say, the differences of the people they had invaded, they had colonized, instead of focusing on their similarities, the fact that they were all humans, for instance, they othered the people they had colonized. They othered Orient, that they saw as inferior to Occident. And in many texts, this is expressed by what I would call essentialist features. That is, in the description of foreigners that we've read about, for instance, in the texts last time, in these descriptions, the foreigners are very seldom individualized. Generally, they all look the same. They all look the same. They are presented as a crowd. They are presented as a group of people, much more as than as individuals. Same thing with the poor, by the way. But it's a way of essentializing foreign people, thinking that they all look like one another, thinking that they are just a category, a community of people, not a series of individuals. And this is a way of making them allegedly inferior, because they are not individuals, they are a group with exactly the same features, all looking like one another. Very often they describe them as animals, they describe them as naughty children, all acting and all looking the same. So there's obviously a dehumanizing process at stake. I'm going to give you the definition of othering by Gayatri Spivak. Gayatri Spivak is an Indian author. Well, she lives in the United States, but she is of Indian origin. Gayatri, G-I-Y-A-T-R-I, Spivak, S-P-I-V-A-K. And she says about othering that it is, and this is the quote, a process by which the empire can define itself. It's a process by which the empire can define itself against those it colonizes, virgule, excludes and marginalizes. So it's a process by which the empire can define itself against those it colonizes, excludes and marginalizes. Là, vous mettez des crochets, 3 petits points, je passe à une autre phrase. The business of creating the enemy, crochet, 3 petits points, in order that the empire might define itself by its geographical and racial others. So, othering is a process by which the empire can define itself against those it colonizes, excludes and marginalizes. The business of creating the enemy in order that the empire might define itself by its geographical and racial others. What it means is that there's a binary dialectical relationship between the self and other. And the other is fantasized, is created in order to better define the self. By defining the colonies as inferior, uncivilized, wild, savage, etc., the imperialists especially defined themselves as superior, civilized, etc. C'est une dame. Pas de chance. Gayatri, G-A-Y-A-T-R-I, Spivak, S-P-I-V-A-K. Voilà. C'est une professeure, je ne sais plus dans quelle université américaine, d'origine indienne, qui a beaucoup écrit sur la notion de othering. And Spivak also uses another term for colonized, a term which is interesting because we may also use it not only for foreigners, but also when we study women and poor people. She uses the term subaltern to speak of all those people who are partly inaudible in the public sphere, who are partly invisible in the public sphere. For instance, women in India. She devotes a whole chapter to women in India, and she calls them subalterns in the sense that they can't voice their difference, they can't voice their feelings, they can't voice their ideas, their thoughts, etc. So the subalterns. And the subaltern means someone of inferior rank or of supposed inferior rank. And to her, she uses this term in the field of colonial studies to refer to the colonized subject, but also to all those who are like colonized, like women in some countries, like poor people also. And she also uses another image, which we have already mentioned, which is the image of the periphery. The image of the periphery. Colonized people are the periphery, while the colonizer is the center. Same image as with the heart or the brain and the limbs and arms and legs, you see. So the subaltern or the peripheral people. Right. So now I'd like to focus on how the othering process, which was already at stake in urban exploration, as we've seen, which was already at stake in exploration at home, that is urban exploration, the meeting, the encounters with foreign people in England, how this process of othering was developed through exploration abroad. So you need a little context to be able to understand the extent of exploration abroad in the 19th century, and I'm going to start with this. Urban exploration, as we saw last time, made of the city a contested space. You remember I quoted Judith Wolkowitz's words, who said in the article that, well, we've read some excerpts from last time, she speaks of the city as a contested terrain or a contested space for class and gender encounters, but also for encounters between foreigners and non-foreigners. But this contested space was also reproduced abroad through exploration abroad. And beyond mapping the city and the uncharted territories of the city, the Victorians also wanted to map the unexplored territories of the world. And this was made as part of their so-called civilizing mission. That is, what they wanted to do by mapping the world was to impose their vision of the world on the whole world. And of course there was a competition between the French the British, partly the Portuguese, the Belgians at the time, that is, all the imperial powers, to impose their point of view, which was not always exactly the same. At the time, the situation was particularly good for such a development of exploration. The means of communication had developed at a very rapid pace. That is, it was possible to send telegraphs to the colonies, so that it was easier to organize, for instance, a journey simply to the colonies, because you could very easily get in contact, get in touch with someone who lived there, a colonizer most of the time. Means of transport had developed as well, the steamboats, the trains, etc., which meant that it was more and more rapid to go from Britain to the colonies, even if, of course, it took quite a long time. It still took quite a long time, but it was nothing compared with the situation a century before. So, with all these improvements in communication means, in transport means, exploration was made easier and easier at the end of the 19th century. And a second aspect was the development of tourism at the time. The explorers, of course, could be people sent by the government or scientists that wanted to study something in Africa or other countries, but you also had more and more tourists. Most of them wealthy tourists, upper middle class people, aristocratic people. But little by little, mass tourism started to develop. And mass tourism was developed thanks to a man whom you all know. His name is Thomas Cook, and his tourist bureaus or agencies still exist today. Thomas Cook was the man who invented mass tourism. Well, initially, he didn't mean to do it for money. And it's especially after his death that the Thomas Cook Company became such a big company. Initially, Thomas Cook was simply what you called at the time a temperance campaigner. That is, he campaigned in British cities, he campaigned to find ways to prevent people from drinking. Because temperance campaigner, it's this temperance, it means the fight against drinking, against alcohol. So he just wanted to find occupations for people who drank, poor people most of the time, and he decided to organize travels for them. And initially it was a very small-scale type of travel. For instance, he organized one day in the nearest city, for instance, using the train. So he negotiated the train fares with the train stations, and he included lunch. And he took these people, mostly poor people, or at least the lower class people, he took them for one day by train to the nearest city. He organized the lunch, and it was very cheap at the beginning. That is, almost anybody could afford to take a day off with Thomas Cook. So initially, it was really almost a kind of social participation. This is what Thomas Cook wanted to do initially. But as time passed by, so he started this in the 1840s, 1850s. But as time passed by, he started to become a professional travel agent, professional travel guide as well, and he started selling tours to Scotland, and then to France, to Switzerland, to Italy, to Germany, Europe first. Well, of course, people from the lower classes could not afford a tour of Switzerland or France, but people from the middle class could sometimes afford it. And this is how tourism became mass tourism, little by little. Of course, it took years and years and decades to become the mass tourism we know today. But Thomas Cook was really at the origin of this. In 1851, for instance, for the Great Exhibition, he was also the one who organized the days, well, not the days, but the trips of hundreds and even thousands of workers who went to London by train to spend a day at the Great Exhibition. Victoria wanted lower class people to participate in the Great Exhibition. And there were days when the entrance was not free, but it cost maybe 1 penny or something like that, the penny days. And Thomas Cook was asked to organize these trips, and he became famous after this. So after the 1850s, he started to develop his business, and he became the successful travel agent that is still known today, or at least his name is still known today. So little by little, he became one of the promoters of mass tourism, and he sent doctors, lawyers, etc. to visit the beauties of the world. And after Europe, he extended his trips to Egypt, for instance, or different African countries or Asian countries. So little by little, Thomas Cook could reach the whole of the world with its trips. And of course, this meant that more and more people, even if it remained a minority at the time, could also visit the countries in question and make encounters in these countries. So the only way to meet foreigners was no longer at home, but also abroad during your visits, during your trips abroad, even if this was reserved for a minority initially. So this means that the encounters with the other became accessible to all those who could afford these trips, that is, more and more people at the time. And you have to understand that at the time, the fact that more and more people could have access to such trips was not particularly appreciated by the upper classes. They considered that leisure was something reserved for them. They were called the leisured classes because they didn't work. The aristocrats didn't work. They had money, but the money came from their family, from their lands. They did not work initially. Well, at the end of the 19th century, most aristocratic families became less and less wealthy, so some of them had to work. But initially, they were the leisured class, and they considered that it was completely vulgar to open the possibility of trips to visit beautiful countries to all types of people. So at the beginning, but we'll speak of this when we focus on the vision of poverty, when the new visibility of the poor. Initially, this new visibility of the poor in the public space, including during holidays at the seaside or abroad, was very badly received by the higher classes, by the upper classes, who saw something very vulgar in the attitude of middle-class people or lower-class people, and who didn't want to share the same space with them. I'd like now to start from a few pictures available online on this site. Yes, this site. So it's an educational site, but this is not the point. It's called the Art of African Exploration, and there's a series of pictures, especially, for instance, an imperfectly known land, yes, showing how the first explorers who went to Africa, whether they be British explorers, French explorers, Belgian explorers, etc., they very often published texts about their explorations, explaining what they had discovered abroad, but also pictures, pictures and maps. And the maps are quite interesting. If you take this one, for instance, it's this one, I think. So this map is a map dating back to 1873. Yeah. It's a map of Africa. It's a map of Africa, and you see that all these blank spaces here, and it's 1873, which is already towards the end of the 19th century. But you see all these white or blank spaces here, or even here. They showed the places that had not been explored yet, that had not been mapped yet, in a way. And otherwise, you see that how the imperialists completely transformed Africa into their own image. Look at the names here. They're all the names of the explorers who explored these parts: Addison, Chenier, Jackson, Lempriere, etc. As if Africa had lost its identity and had been simply transformed into a series of names, which are the names of the explorers who discovered Africa. Of course, they did not discover Africa. They just went there for the first time as Europeans. But there were many African people there who already knew the country, who already knew these regions, but they were considered unimportant, and only the names of the explorers, of the British explorers and European explorers are indicated here. And you see that mostly what was explored at the time was mostly the periphery. That is, all that was easily accessible to the explorers. The coast, I would say. You see, all the coast down to Cape, to South Africa, and all along the coast on the west and on the east. But in the center of Africa, there was still this blank space on the map, which indicated that a lot of territory still had to be mapped by European people. Another map is this one. No, another map is this. No, is it this one I showed, or I can't remember? No, it's the other one. So this is another map where you see again how Europe was mapped with many pieces of information concerning Europe, and on the other hand, Africa, with information appearing once again along the coast, but many blank spaces still to be discovered by the Europeans here. So the opposition between the coast, where the explorers had gone, and the heart of Africa, the unknown parts, as they were called, what was called at the time darkest Africa. And that completely fascinated Europeans, because they had the impression that in the heart of Africa was reflected all the primitive instincts of man, due to their vision of the world, of course. You see as well that well, it's not obvious here, but very often the African words for the villages, the cities, etc., were replaced by British words or French words. So that even today, even if most of the time this has been changed, but not always, you still have English or French names for villages and cities. Well, most of the time this has been changed, but it's not always the case, and this dates back to this period, to that period, the Victorian period, when the explorers came to Africa and started to impose their way of life, their customs to African people. So you see the type of book that was published, for instance. Well, this is about Central Asia with drawings representing a kind of tent, for instance, so that all Victorians could be aware of the type of dwelling that concerned the people of the country, with, you see, many details, 25 or even 30 feet in diameter, forms 2 camel loads, about half a ton in weight. So very precise details, always this thirst for knowledge that characterized the Victorians and that they tried to pass on through books, through drawings. You find exactly the same type of description, for instance, of the flora or the fauna of Africa. For instance, or the beasts of Africa, the animals of Africa, with many drawings, you see, naturalistic drawings of a rhino or a giraffe or different animals that, of course, were unknown in Britain, and that the explorers liked describing in detail so as to make people understand the difference between their own country and the country that they discovered. So you had many such accounts, visual accounts or textual accounts of the explorations in Africa. If you look at this part, it's the part concerning 2 great explorers of the time, Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley. David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley, second part of the 19th century. And the different pictures that are included here are quite interesting because they show the way their exploration was advertised at the time. You have to know that the explorers at the time were very often considered to be real heroes. They were heroes in the sense that they represented the civilizing mission of the British. So they were supposed to be the best men sent to Africa so as to try to tame Africa or India. This was the way people thought at the time. Here, for instance, you have a picture of David Livingstone telling the story of David Livingstone in Africa. And you see it was a kind of picture model, full directions for making up the story of picture on back of sheet, with when cut out, this sheet makes a charming model scene. You know, it's, I don't know what it's called in French, either, comment ça s'appelle les trucs, vous voyez ce que c'est? On les plie et puis ça fait des trucs en 3 dimensions. C'est des, je sais pas comment ça s'appelle. Les panoramas. On le trouve souvent dans les magazines pour enfants. On découpe, puis après on remonte les personnages. Non. Et puis les personnages... Vous voyez, on voit bien, il y a les traits pour couper, là, pour plier. Et donc vous pliez, puis là les personnages vont être debout dans le... Oui, c'est comme des pop-up, mais ça a un autre nom. Oui, c'est... Vous savez, les livres aussi, où on ouvre la page, et puis ça a un nom, ce truc. Je sais pas comment c'est. Bon, enfin bref, cette chose-là. Je sais pas le nom ni en anglais ni en français. Et voyez, là, vous avez tous les petits personnages. Alors, il y a les personnages africains, donc ils sont là. Il y a le colon qui est là. Et puis, ça recrée les aventures de David Livingstone. And this was very fashionable at the time, either for children to imagine adventures in Africa, or even for adults. So this one is an example of the type of advertising that was made at the time. Another example was this. It was the beginning of mass consumption, and they created cups, exactly as today you have a cup with the royal baby. So here, this was a cup with David Livingstone that they sold for those who admired David Livingstone. This was the beginning of mass consumption as well, the late Victorian period. So this is not surprising in itself. You also had articles in newspaper advertising, for instance, lectures held by David Livingstone when he came back home. Generally, he held the lectures to explain what he had seen in the tropics, for instance. So you had big articles like these. And you see, for instance, they called the Victoria Falls. These are falls in Africa, very important fall. There was an expedition to find these falls, and they were named after Victoria, once again imposing colonization even on the names of the places themselves. So you have also this type of pictures. This one is a carte de visite. So you see, it's a picture of Livingstone in the foreground with a black boy in the background. Well, you see, in a way, they pose on the picture that the whiteness of Livingstone, even his costume, contrasts with the black skin of the boys, the fact that he's fully dressed, the fact that the boy is half naked, and this, of course, tended to show the supposed superiority of the white man over the black boy. And well, this type of picture was also quite typical at the time. Well, this is not Livingstone, this is Stanley, in the dress he wore when he met Livingstone in Africa. Because Stanley, in fact, je ne sais pas si vous connaissez la phrase Docteur Livingstone, je suppose. Non? Oh, c'est un truc connu. Quand Stanley a été envoyé pour retrouver Livingstone, qui était perdu au milieu de la jungle, il y a eu une expédition, voilà, et l'histoire, la rumeur, il n'y avait pas Twitter et les réseaux sociaux à l'époque, mais enfin c'était tout comme. La rumeur, c'est qu'ils se sont simplement dit, quand ils se sont rencontrés, vous voyez, genre au bout de 3 mois de marche à travers la jungle, tout ça, il a vu cet homme blanc arriver, il lui a dit « Dr. Livingstone, I presume », et puis c'est tout. Voilà. Donc ça, c'est pour montrer, vous voyez, le calme britannique. Je ne sais pas si ça s'est vraiment passé comme ça, on n'y était pas. Mais j'allais dire, la légende veut ça. Hein, c'est qu'ils se sont rencontrés, ils se sont simplement dit « Dr. Livingstone, I presume ». Voilà. Okay, so this type of picture as well. Books, of course, you see, this one, for instance, in darkest Africa. And once again, you see the contrast, well, it's difficult to see because of the red background, but the contrast between the black man in the background and the white man, all in white in the foreground. The colon and the colonized, the colonizer and the colonized. So always staging, in a way, always staging the colonized and the colonizer, and the colonized as supposedly inferior to the colonizer. So you have all these examples here. I'm not going to show them all, of course, but you have all these examples here. So it was really very, very popular at the time to follow the adventures of the explorers. So I'll take this one with Stanley, and again you see how imperialism is staged here, with the man, the only one sitting but above the others. He's sitting but still above the others because he's on the horse like this, and all the other men, black men and women, following him, helping him, and being obviously represented as in a very paternalistic way. Stanley seems to be their father here. He's the guide, even if, of course, he needed these men to guide them in Africa, because these men knew the region that he discovered. But still, he appears as the guide, as the father here, with his binoculars and on his horse. You also had well, I've not... I think I have one or two examples. But I've not... no, that's not what I want. Oh, you have many different documentaries that you can easily find on YouTube, for instance, about the scramble for Africa at the end of the 19th century, which is quite interesting. This one, no, it's not the one I wanted. I had one of the Victorian Falls, but, well, not these ones. And I haven't... oh, well, never mind. Maybe... Can you... Pour ça, sinon j'arrête. Non. C'est bizarre parce que c'était là-dedans, mais... je ne trouve pas avec ça. Bon, de toute façon, je vous en montrerai quelques-uns plus tard, donc c'est pas... je vous montrerai à ce moment-là. Alors, on va prendre maintenant... Avant de terminer sur cette partie, on va prendre maintenant quelques... Voilà, des extraits ici. Donc c'est dans le document des semaines 3 à 6. Alors, so, it's two texts I'd like to read with you. On l'avait vu avec vous ce texte, Lazarus Lotus Eating, ou pas? Je crois pas, hein, la semaine dernière. Alors, je vais commencer par là, même si ça revient en arrière, mais j'ai un autre cours où je l'ai utilisé, et je ne savais plus avec qui je l'avais utilisé. Bref, sur un autre sujet d'ailleurs, mais bon. On va déjà regarder celui-là. Je reviens un petit peu en arrière, je reviens à ce qu'on avait vu la dernière fois. Je suis désolée, mais j'aurais dû commencer par là et j'ai oublié. Ce qu'on avait vu la dernière fois sur la perception donc, des étrangers à Londres. Et ce texte-là, alors on avait vu un petit peu les caricatures des Irlandais, etc. Ça, on l'avait vu. On avait regardé, je crois... est-ce qu'on avait regardé les textes sur les Juifs et les Irlandais ou pas du tout? Non, je crois pas. Si, on les avait regardés avec vous, d'accord. Mais on n'avait pas vu celui-là, d'accord. Donc, regardez celui-là, Lazarus. Alors, il y a celui-là aussi que vous pourrez lire par vous-même, mais celui-là parce qu'il est particulièrement frappant. So, it dates back to 1869. And Lazarus' lotus eating, you immediately understand that it's going to deal with what kind of immigrants? Asian immigrants. 9 o'clock, so typically it's an urban explorer writing an account of an evening, probably in the East End of London. 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, the place Cornhill and the wanted policeman, ça j'ai pas compris. Ah si, the wanted policeman, the place is Cornhill and the want, that is what they needed, was a policeman. Wonderfully empty and still are the city haunts we have passed. Curiously quiet too is the vast thoroughfare we are in. Shops and warehouses, banks and offices are closed, And though here and there a blaze of light tells you how to telegraph to India, or glimmers out of one of the upper windows of the closely shuttered house as you pass, the great street is wonderfully free from the feverish traffic of the day. Lazarus starts up out of the shadows, which fantastically combine together on the pavement under the illuminated clock to the left, and having yielded to his prayer for pence, you and I look out anxiously for a policeman to aid us in tracing him home. Perhaps we carry with us a mysterious talisman which will at once enlist the sympathies and ensure the cooperation of the force. Perhaps we rely on our powers of personal persuasion. Perhaps we have justice on our side and claim its officers as allies. Perhaps we wish to test the truthfulness of the pitiful story he has told us, or perhaps we are merely animated by a holy hatred of beggars and a wish to prosecute Lazarus to the death. I'd like to stop and focus on this first paragraph. What do we understand about the place that is being described here from this paragraph? What are the pieces of information we have that help you define the type of place they are in? I mean, the urban explorers and this man they call Lazarus. Countryside or city? City, obviously, with the feverish traffic of the day. What time of day? Night, yes. Sunday, Saturday evening, yes. So you have warehouses, banks, offices, which are closed. And you have this, a blaze of light telling you how to telegraph to India. So this is a reference to the modern means of communication, the modernity of the city, and probably the fact that in the neighborhood there are Indian people living. It's difficult to know whether the place is a poor place or a place in the West End, but there's one thing which is quite striking. They are looking for a policeman to aid us in tracing him home. Why do they need a policeman, according to you? Or why do they feel the need for a policeman? Absolutely, because they don't feel safe, and at the time, and we'll see this when we study poor neighborhoods and the way they became visible, at the time people visiting poor neighborhoods generally asked for the help of a policeman, or at least they asked to be accompanied in the poor neighborhoods. So it's because they're going to follow this man home, and this man probably lives in the East End of London, in the poor neighborhoods of London, that they need the presence of a policeman. What we know about the man is not much initially, but Lazarus starts up out of the shadows, which fantastically combine together on the pavement under the illuminated clock to the left, and having yielded to his prayer for pence, you and I look out anxiously for a policeman to aid us in tracing him home. In this sentence, we learn at least two elements about the man they call Lazarus. Well, first, why do they call him Lazarus? Is it his name, according to you? Obviously not. Obviously not. So what does it show about their perception of Indian people or foreign people in general? The fact that they give him a name, which is obviously not his name. If you... Avec les rois mages. C'est dans la Bible, les rois mages, c'est Lazarus. Je suis pas douée, moi, là-dedans. Hein? Possible. Balthazar. Ah oui, parce que je me disais, Lazare, ça me semblait bizarre. Oui, Balthazar. Non, c'est un personnage de la Bible. Lazare, c'est pas celui qui renaît de ses cendres. Si, il me semble. Et born again, c'est ça. Mais je sais pas pourquoi, j'ai pas gardé. Parce que je sais pas s'il y a un. Ouais, c'est un martyr perse, donc ça vient peut-être de là plutôt, vous voyez. Moi, je pense tout simplement que c'est un moyen, là encore, d'essentialiser l'Indien, c'est-à-dire tous les Indiens, on les appelle Lazarus, quoi. Hein, c'est comme le chinois de la caricature, il s'appelle John Chinaman. Hein, c'est pareil. Donc c'est un moyen de les réduire à... de leur refuser une identité, en fait. C'est un Indien, quoi. Voilà, donc on l'appelle Lazare. Comme on appellerait, je sais pas moi, c'est comme les gens racistes qui vont dire, oh, ben ça c'est encore un Mohamed par exemple, c'est exactement pareil. Hein, ben si, c'est la même chose, ben, il y en a encore qui le disent, hein. J'en ai déjà entendu. Donc ben, c'est tout à fait ça, c'est exactement la même chose, Lazarus. Okay, so this we know. The second thing is that, what do you think of what they say? He starts up out of the shadows which fantastically combine together. It seems that when they are close to this Lazarus, who's probably not named Lazarus, obviously, it's as if the atmosphere became almost mystic, yes, almost mystic. As if his presence was enough to make the atmosphere strange, to make the atmosphere eerie, almost ghost-like, you know. And the second element we learn about Lazarus, this Indian man, is that they have yielded to his prayer for pence, which means that Lazarus is, if they have yielded to his prayer for pence, it means that he is a beggar. Yeah, it means that he is a beggar. Okay. And you see that immediately, and this is very typical of this fear of contamination that I was speaking of at the beginning of the lesson. Immediately it seems that these very rational British gentlemen are becoming more or less contaminating with this mystic environment. They start speaking about a mysterious talisman, you see, a mysterious talisman. As if the presence of this Indian man, the presence or the implicit presence of the customs of India, of the country India, was enough to transform these so-called rational Victorian gentlemen into people who believe in such things as talismans, right? So this is quite interesting here. The rest of the text is particularly striking as well. Let us look at him again. Shabby canvas trousers, a loose and ragged blue jacket, high cheekbones, small sunken eyes, a bare shaven face, and an untidy pigtail. Such is Lazarus. He is one of the poor and wretched Chinamen who shiver and cower and whine at our street corners, and are mean and dirty, squalid and contemptible, even beyond beggars generally. See how he slinks and shambles along, and note the astonishment of the policemen we meet at last when we tell him we wish to follow the abject wretch home. We have gone through Cornhill and Leadenhall Street, past the corner where a waterman is pottering about with a lantern, a modern Diogenes, who is perhaps looking for an honest man, and are close by Aldgate Pump, and in the full glare of the huge clothing establishment at the Minories corner, before we come upon our policemen. New Court, Palmer's Folly, Bluegate Fields, that is where the Chinese opium smoking house is, and that is where Lazarus is bound for. In fact, Lazarus is not Indian, he is Chinese. So, look at the description of this Asian man. Shabby canvas trousers, loose and ragged blue jacket. Well, this is his clothes. Obviously, he's poor, given the description. What is more interesting is the physical description of the man. High cheekbones, small sunken eyes, bare-shaven face, untidy pigtail. What do you think of this description? It's a series of stereotypes, the stereotypes about Chinese people. That is the fact that they have high cheekbones, the fact that they have sunken eyes, and the fact that they have an untidy is a compliment, but a pigtail. So he, once again, essentializes this man, this Chinaman, as he calls him, which didn't mean that he was Chinese, by the way, but he calls him a Chinaman. He essentializes this man and makes him look like, it's exactly as calling him Lazarus. It essentializes him and makes him look like, according to him, to any Asian man or any Chinese man. When he calls him an abject wretch, what do you think of the choice of these two words? The noun, a wretch, and the adjective, abject. So, abject wretch. It expresses what kind of feeling? Obviously here. Disgust, yes. It's complete disgust. It's complete rejection. It's complete repulsion that he expresses here. And this man is going to an opium smoking house. As I've said, Chinese people were associated, or Asian people generally speaking, were associated with opium dens, opium smoking houses, and this is why. And the places that are quoted are places in the East End of London. It's near the Tower of London, Aldgate, and especially the Minories. And at the time, well, today there are places which are completely safe places, but at the time they were considered to be very dangerous places. I know them Chinamen well, adds Mr. Policeman sententiously. They'll beg and doff and dodge about the West End. We won't have them here, and never spend nothing of what they make till night. They don't care for no drink, and seem to live without eating, so far as I know. It's their opium at night they lice, and you'll find half a dozen of them in one bed at Yahees smoking and sleeping away, like so many lime kilns and dormice. No, sir, it wouldn't be at all safe for you to venture up Newport alone, It ain't the Chinamen, nor the Lascars, nor yet the Bengalese, as would hurt you, but there's an uncommon rough crew of English hanging in about there, and it would be better for you to have a constable with you, much better. And if you go to Lehman Street, the inspector will put you in the way. This was all the information we needed from the policeman. So, you see, and this we find in many accounts written by urban explorers at the time, the fact that very often, when they wanted to go to the poor neighborhoods, they were told against going there by the police, who considered that it was too dangerous, or that they needed to have a policeman with them. So this is why he says, you need to have a constable. A constable is a policeman. You need to have a constable with you. But it is the words of the policeman about these foreigners, these Asian people, which is of interest to me here. How can you say that the policeman obviously also essentializes Asian people? And it's almost ridiculous here, the way he does it also. Et malheureusement, on entend encore des choses comme ça. Oh, ces gens-là, ils savent parfois.
They're addicted to opium?
Yeah, well, there's the notion that they're addicted to opium, which was true for some of them, but not for all of them, of course. But what is particularly ridiculous is this. They don't care for no drink and seem to live without eating, so far as I know. You see, the Asian people are seen as absolutely abnormal, subhuman species who do not need either drink or food to survive. They don't drink, they just take opium, which of course was not true. But, you know, they don't care for no drink. They seem to live without eating, so far as I know. So a generalization which is completely untrue, of course, but which shows the othering process. They are not like us. They don't drink, they don't need food, they don't need drink. They are not like us.
And they are linked to title with the autophagy and
Yeah.
ancient Greece. Like EPs.
Yes.
With, you know, addicted to some drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also a way of othering them, obviously. And at the same time, what is interesting, even if it's not the point of our lesson today, is that the policeman admits that they are not the most dangerous. Who are the most dangerous people, according to him? People whom he treats exactly in the same way as these foreigners. The crew, the uncommon crew, rough crew of English hanging in and about there, that is English poor, the English poor. That is, even below the foreigners were the English poor. And we'll see when we focus on the new visibility of the poor, that the poor were treated exactly in the same way as the foreigners, sometimes even more violently than the foreigners. So the race aspect was present, obviously, but it was not the only one present at the time. Yes, so the essentialization of foreigners, which is obvious here in the words of the policeman. Now, look at what comes next, and especially, where is it? Yeah, here. Pushing through the small crowd outside the station, they are outside a police station, so you have people going from and to the police station. Crossing a long flagged court and ascending a few steps to the right, we present our credentials to the inspector of duty. So now they are inside the police station. A one-eyed gentleman is in the dock and oscillates up and down on the iron railing round it like a Ninan puppet whose wires are broken. He is an Irishman whose impulsive nature has led him to savagely bite and scratch the landlord of a public house near for having dared to pronounce him drunk and for refusing him a further supply of stimulants. The landlord prefers the charge and shows a bleeding forefinger from which the nail has been torn. Irishman protests that he is a poor working man who doesn't like to be insulted. Tipsy friends of Irishman noisily prefer themselves as witnesses to his general virtue and the extreme meekness of his disposition, and then retire grumbling. So first scene at the police station, this time it does not involve Asian people, but Irish people. The same process of othering is at stake. The Irishman is not called by his name, he is called Irishman. Not even with the article. Irishman says, like John Chinaman, right? So Irishman said, as if his Irish identity was all that defined him. That is, as if it was the whole of his identity. And once again, the Irishman is associated with what immediately? What kind of features? Alcohol drinking, yes. Aggressiveness. And especially the fact that he seems to be able to speak only by biting people. Instead of using words, he bites people. He scratches and bites people. And you have the adverb savagely, you have the bleeding forefinger, the nail that has been torn, etc., etc. So the Irishman is associated with someone aggressive, with someone drunk. And there's something quite interesting here when he says, here's an Irishman whose impulsive nature has led him, as if all Irishmen had an impulsive nature. Right? Then he goes on with the description of, and he says, you see how he reduces these two Irishmen to the biter and the bit. The biter and the bit. Celui qui a mordu, puis celui qui a été mordu. The biter and the bit. Once again, a way of dehumanizing them. Then you have a shrieking lady, probably an Irish woman this time. And this time, where is it? No, it's not here. Yeah. At the end of the extract, the time spent at the two stations has not been lost, for it is now only 10:30, and the opium revels are seldom at their height before 11. There is no limit to the variety of nationalities patronizing the wretched hovel we are about to visit. From every quarter of the globe, and more immediately from every district in London, men come to Old Yahi, which is the opium smoking house, the sole bond between them being a love of opium and a partiality for Yahi's brand. Sailors, stewards, shopmen, mountebanks, beggars, outcasts, and thieves meet on perfect equality in Newport and then smoke themselves into dreamy stupefaction. So, once again, this idea of contamination is very present in this paragraph. The fact that opium contaminates them, and that they contaminate, it comes from Asia initially, and that it contaminates even English people, which is expressed here. But just before, it was at the beginning, sometimes, which I haven't... yeah, we have not focused here. I can't find... No. Well, no, never mind. It was another extract, but it doesn't matter. Right. Now take another text, which is this one, published in The Spectator. So we're going back to exploration abroad. A text published in The Spectator in 1892, a short text, entitled simply Explorations and Explorations. We wonder whether the thought is that of an individual and generated by a particular course of reading, or whether the majority of those who study geography share the feeling of the present writer that each kind of the many explorations now going on in the world leaves its own distinctive spiritual impression. It's difficult to read of geographical discovery in Africa without an almost physical sense of disgust. The work of the explorer there is perhaps the most fruitful of all, for it brings rich regions into touch with civilization and opens roads through which order and peace and wise direction may be brought to the aid of races who during 3,000 years have hardly advanced more than their own elephants have done, beasts which as yet are purely savage and show no aptitude even for the carrying of burdens. Vous imaginez, ça c'est un texte écrit en 1892, on est quand même à la fin du 19e siècle, et voilà la vision du Spectator, qui est un journal, je veux dire, c'est pas le journal à sensation, hein, le Spectator, c'est un journal tout à fait respectable, entre guillemets. So, first, the feeling of disgust towards Africa, and a feeling of disgust, why? Because according to the writer, this country needs what? What does the country need, according to the writer here? Order and peace. Order and peace. And according to the writer, this order and peace can only be brought by Europeans, by the colonizers. Yes. As if colonization had been a peaceful process. But what is especially shocking is the way African people are described. They are people who have hardly advanced more than their own elephants So you see immediately reducing them to the state of animals. Beasts which as yet are purely savage and show no aptitude even for the carrying of burdens. Here he's speaking of the elephants, not of the African people. The beasts who as yet are purely savage and show no aptitude even for the carrying of burdens. But as he has just said before, that African people had not advanced more than elephants, this means that this is exactly what he thinks about African people and African civilization. So the reduction of African people to the state of animal. The task requires from those who perform it the utmost heroism, the most persistent endurance of all the evils that flesh can suffer, a courage which can face not only danger from men, but the worst forms of disease, a patience in which the sense of time is gradually obliterated and months of suspense are borne as if they were but days. So here it's the heroic dimension of the colonizer, according to the article. The fact, exactly as in Rudyard Kipling's poem, the fact that the colonizer is a hero, and he's a hero who sacrifices his life, so they thought, to save or try to save African people who, according to the article, did not deserve this. So it was, in a way, for the author of the article, almost a kind of useless sacrifice, because the African people, according to the author, would not be able to live up to the expectations of the colonizers. And we'll stop here for today because the rest of the text is long and, well, quite long, and we'll stop reading, finish reading it next time. Donc là, vous avez vraiment une représentation du dégoût qui était exprimé face aux autres civilisations, celles qu'on considérait comme n'étant pas des civilisations parce qu'elles ne ressemblaient pas à la civilisation.